Ginger broke up with Trip on a sunny afternoon, surrounded by couples drinking coffee. When she told him, he stared at her like he was auditioning for a horror film. He asked if she was afraid of him, and Ginger told him she was afraid she'd cut his throat while he slept. He became so quiet, it hushed the tables around him. It was as though he could absorb sound, an auditory black hole. Trip had never been violent, but he sensed the potential. Inspiration arrived in the pause. "You know I want a baby," she said. "What the fuck?" "I knew you didn't want kids, and I was afraid I'd lose you if I said I did. Now I can see it's too important to me." Trip licked his lips and relaxed very slightly. "Aren't you too old?" It was a perfect opportunity to cry, and she took it. She'd been hanging 10 on the very crest of calamity, and now she could abandon control. "I didn't mean that," Trip said. "I don't know anything about it." "You do mean it. I've always sensed it." "Ginger, this is nuts. I don't know what you're talking about." "Boy, did you say a mouthful," she said. She squinted at him and tried to hiss the words. It was too soon to stand up and walk out. He probably didn't have enough money to pay for their coffee anyway. He looked like he might cry. Oh, fuck, she was his if he did. "Don't be such a baby," she said. "You're crabby and mean, and you're always giving me the third degree. You won't cuddle." She knew she could say anything. "That isn't true." "Well, anyway, I want a baby," said Ginger quickly. "I won't cuddle?" "What?" he said. "The fuck?" She dug an old Kleenex and a $5 bill out of her purse. "Wait," said Trip. She tossed the 5 on the table and stood up. "I can't talk about it right now," she said. Trip watched her walk away but didn't try pursuit. His mind was searching for a piece of solid ground. Ginger called a travel agent and booked a ticket for Amsterdam. Trip spent his time cleaning up his sublet. He didn't have visitors and he didn't have a girlfriend. He could find no reason to keep a place clean without one or the other. The owners were in Cuba for another couple of days. He couldn't grasp it. It cost a fortune to travel, and nobody speaks English when you get there. You drink the water and you enter the bathroom for the rest of your vacation. He didn't know why people travel, but he was glad they did. He'd had this place before. He didn't know them well enough to hear their stories or look at their pictures, and Trip never asked about anything except the weather. Weather is everything to people who travel. He probably would have expressed his feelings this very way before he'd begun his weekly injections. Now he saw things a little differently. A moronic twosome were about to return from their witless vacation. Welcome home to your middle-class paradise. It was obvious the wife yearned for his body, although this had never occurred to him before. She wanted Trip because Douglas was gay. They give themselves away, those guys. Not Doug or Charlie, but Charles and Douglas. There was no short form for Trip. He would find another sublet. Sometimes he didn't charge any rent, and all they expected was that he'd water the plants and feed the cat. They all had cats. The women who took him home were usually strangers. I don't know why I can't see this. The women who took him home were usually strangers, living in apartments that were beige and functional. Neat and clean, but definitely not fun. Celery standing in a glass of water in the fridge, and one tiny container of expired milk. Maybe a sad bra and a couple of pairs of panties with the elastic stretched, hanging over the shower rail. One box of cereal. He really hoped that's how his ex was living, but she had a TV with a screen as big as a sports fan's. Her plates and cups all matched. The place looked like fun because the color of the walls and furniture were way too bright for him. Nothing sad about it. Nice place to visit, but he couldn't live there. Men almost never took him home because they were usually married. Sometimes Trip was too. Aiden was the first guy he'd had in what, 5 years? 6? Oh, fuck. That nice guy from Vancouver. 3 months ago, maybe 4, and it lasted a night. If you count episodes less than an hour long, okay, there've been guys. Less than a dozen, and some of them only 15 minutes long. Aiden made him forget there had been anyone before him. None of this meant Trip was gay, naturally. If he was gay, he'd like cleaning up and he liked colorful apartments. End of discussion. Ginger went to Amsterdam. Trip went to Susie's. Ginger loved Amsterdam. It looked as flat as the prairies from the window of the train she boarded at the airport. A dozen people were waiting at the station, offering cheap places to stay. Ginger chose a boat hotel, a motel. She couldn't have made a better choice. She was given a tiny room with a porthole. The boat moved no more violently than a waterbed, and she hoped it stayed that way. Her money belt was tied around her waist, passport and traveler's checks zipped inside, made her look a bit chubby, but only a bit. She went up to the main deck on whatever sailors called it. Maybe the poop deck, for God's sake. What inspired these names? Winnie the Pooh and Howdy Doody. Poop deck didn't come up very often in her circles. Was there an obsession with human waste, or was it just her? Brown nosing. She walked into a large open room, like the cafeteria on the ferry to Nanaimo. Now she'd be able to say that the cafeteria on the ferry to Nanaimo was like the upper deck of a motel in Amsterdam. Windows on 3 sides, a bar on the 4th, wrapped sandwiches under glass. There were 7 or 8 densely populated tables in the middle of the room, surrounded by nothing but space. Young people. They didn't stop talking when she walked in, and not one of them over 30. She almost turned and walked out. Might have guessed. What grown-up would choose a boat over a comfy hotel? She could stay the night and move on. She stayed 10 days. There was dancing and drinking every night, deafening in her room. She only noted it when she was on the bed under some young body. You couldn't call them men, really, boys. The word excited her, and so did the boys. They spoke but couldn't be understood. All their favorite phrases drowned out the guitars and the heavy tread of dancers overhead. Ginger yelled all the words she'd ever wanted to yell, at last. No one ran from the bed, and there were no neighbors to give her shocked looks every time she walked past them in the hall. The boat didn't turn her into the mad slut of the sea. She had only 2 men, one after the other. The first left for England after 4 days, and the next stayed until her time was up. Mid-20s, one tall, the other less so, both from Ireland. They each had their own sterling qualities. Ginger fought her conscience over visiting the Anne Frank house. She decided she'd be forgiven for devoting herself to decadence instead of imagining the agony of a young girl devoured by monsters. It made her feel like Gidget. She wanted to stay on the boat for the rest of her life. It was the drugs, Tripp told Susie. Well, that's convenient. It rains, I get wet. I wouldn't call it convenient. You can sleep on the sofa, Susie said. The sofa was a few feet away from the bed against the opposite wall. Susie was a demon of uncoordinated energy, like a fighter wearing a blindfold. She threw herself at a day as though the bell had just sounded, and by the time she went to bed, it was impossible to tell who'd won. This occurred to Tripp the next day. He was elbowed and kneed as she climbed out of bed, and he fought off the temptation to strangle her. It was a feeling he knew from long before he'd ever taken medication. They're throwing you out faster all the time, Susie said. I don't have a clue about this one, which made him aware that he really knew nothing about Ginger. I've stopped taking the fucking medication, he said. I'm seeing my doc this week. I'm asking you, what is she like? 5'6", red hair to her shoulders, slim. I am so fucking fat, said Susie. Don't look at me. My sister lost 20 pounds when she left Peter. Breaking up does not make me stop eating. I wish it did. Are you hungry? Sure. What color are her eyes? I don't know, Tripp said. Brown? What color are mine? Brown. Green. You don't get breakfast, she said. Maybe yours changed like mine, Tripp said. Don't you wish yours were blue? No. Cereal, that's all I have. I don't eat breakfast, said Susie. Am I still sexy? Tripp kissed her. She stiffened in his arms and tried to play with his hair. He turned his head to protect his eyes. Is she graceful? She hasn't had your life, Tripp said. They drank instant coffee without milk because she had no milk. Not even a sad old carton with a month-old expiry date. He walked her to the subway, and the heat hardly let them breathe. She snaked through the ill-tempered crowds and talked over her shoulder at the same time, jostling not a soul. Tripp followed her in stops and starts, blocked by bodies almost every step. She was a mystery. They stopped at the stairs to the subway and shouted over the roaring traffic. I'll get some stuff for the place, he said, eggs and bread. What are you doing for money these days? Anything I can, Tripp said. He yelled it almost in her ear 3 times and finally settled on nothing. Want some, she asked. Her purse bulged with everything but money. Tripp shook his head and Susie closed her purse. Their lips touched slightly, and he watched her walk down the stairs to the subway. He imagined he had no more than $1 in his jeans, but was too proud to ask for help. She was gone, and he was going to spend the whole day hungry. Maybe he'd given her everything so she could pay off a gambling debt. He would sacrifice eating for her. "Stop," he said out loud. "Stop it, man." The doctor's name tag had a picture of himself that might have been taken for the high school yearbook. Dr. Kell. He was talking about a very effective antidepressant one Tripp had refused to take when he began injecting the ugly medication. Kell wasn't his specialist. The specialist was a nice guy with a sense of humor who was attending a seminar in Costa Rica. "These seminars," Tripp said, "isn't it a little like taking a church congregation to a satanic mass? Drug companies pay for everything, don't they?" "We've had very good results for this particular type," said the doctor. "Will I be able to have sex?" said Tripp. "There's a possibility you'll be dysfunctional, but it's a small price to pay." "Sure," said Tripp. "I could devote myself full-time to checkers." "No." "Is it really so important? You're 40 years old." Dr. Kell looked about 17. "No more than 25, maybe less." "I don't even argue about it anymore," Tripp said. "No." He sat in a chair next to the desk. He sat in a chair next to the desk where the doc stared into a computer. The room had an examination table and an extra chair taking up the rest of the space. It was tiny and familiar. "You can't take the medication on its own," Kell said. "You just proved it." "I want to stay up it anyway. It makes me insane." "It makes everybody insane," said the doc. "Weren't you told?" Tripp said, "It's like making a choice between feeling suicidal and committing suicide. I don't want to take it." This guy was not going to do as he was told. Dr. Kell faced the fact and moved on. "I have something in a different class," he said. "Nowhere nearly so effective, of course, but it will leave you sexually functional." The rage waiting to overtake him made Tripp wonder how long the medication would be there before he left the system. Doctors were beginning to look about the same age as skateboarders. Doctors and cops. Only a month before, that hadn't been true. 40 shouldn't be this old. He wanted to rest. "Listen," Tripp said, "if antidepressants made me unemployable, you treat it like an emergency. I like fucking, and I don't like working, so there you go." "You don't have to win the argument twice," the doctor said. He got to his feet, looking saddened. Tripp had seen it all before. A quiet authority followed by bullying, ridicule, then the helpless shrug, the realization they were powerless to stop his self-destruction. It hadn't worked when their fathers tried it on him, and it wasn't going to work for the sons. Kell left the room. Tripp was wondering if there might be drugs in one of the cupboards when the nurse came in. All nurses are good looking. "The doctor has written you a prescription, but here's some samples," she said brightly. She had a piece of cardboard with about a dozen blue pills stuck to it under plastic. Tripp took it and turned it over. "They're very light," she said, "but you won't take what we recommend. Would you?" "If my life was at stake, I'd do anything," she said. "Anything." "Maybe if I had your life, I would too," Tripp said.